There was a conference in Oxford University, and a prominent businessman was invited to speak. And he said, I have been very successful in my career. I have made a lot of money, more than I had dreamed of, more than I can spend, more than my family needs. And one of the main important motives for me to make money was to hire people to do the things I don't want to do. But there is one thing that I have never been able to do, and that is I have never been able to hire anyone to find out my purpose, my fulfillment in life. I would give anything and everything to discover that. When we look at this man's life, we see that according to the world, he was successful. But deep down inside his heart, he was a failure. He was unsuccessful. He was disappointed. He was defeated. And the main reason that he felt that he was defeated is he did not know what was his purpose and calling in his life. Now, when we look at this man, we need to understand a difference between the job and calling. Job is something that I choose, and calling is something for which I am chosen. Job is I deciding what I want to do, but calling is what God has decided for me to do. And every person who does not know God's call for his life is living a life of failure. It's a failed life when we never understand God's call for our life. Someone said it beautifully. God calls whomever he wants, however he wants, to do whatever he wants. God calls whomever he wants, however he wants, to do whatever he wants. But the most important question that we need to ask is, are we ready to listen to his call? So today we will be looking at, how do I know that God is calling me? How do I know that there is an invitation for me to join ministry? I will be bringing out few very simple points that we know. It will be a kind of reflection and recommitment that we need to look at this. So the first thing about my calling is God speaks only to his children. Who are his children? When we read the Gospel of John chapter 1, verse 12, children who are born again, they are the children of God. When I become born again, I have a personal and close relationship with the Father. When I have a personal relationship with the Father will reveal his will and his call for my life. If I do not have a relationship, then I cannot understand his calling in my life. We may be a Christian, we may go to church, but until and unless there is this personal, intimate, loving, living relationship, I will never understand God's call. And a father will speak only to his son, not somebody else's son. He will speak and reveal his plan only when I am called and I am born again. So that's very important. The second thing about knowing God's call is reading the Word of God. Reading the Word of God. My mother is from a small village in Kerala. And she comes from a very strong Orthodox background. But after she was born again, she was very fascinated with Paul's missionary journey. Many times she will tell me that, Augustine, I was very fond of Paul's missionary journey. Multiple times I have read his journey. But whenever and every time that I read, I used to feel a disturbance in my heart. There was a kind of uneasiness in my heart. I don't know why that was happening. But later on, she came to realize that it was God using Paul's missionary journey, challenging my mother to come into the ministry. And that is how she was called as a missionary. She could know God's call only through reading his word. That's very important, dear friends. We can read every secular book, no matter whatever we have, no matter how many devotionals book. But if we have not prioritized the word of God in our life, then we can never understand God's call and his will in our life. So why do we need to read his word? The first thing in Hebrew, it says, the word of God is alive and active. Not only it is alive and active, but when we are reading, it penetrates straight into our soul. It hits us. It shows us what we need to do. That's very important. And the second reason why we need to read the Bible is in Isaiah 20, in 30:21, it says, he is going to lead us like a voice. This is the path that we need. Many times we are confused. Why? Because we have not given the priority of reading the word of God. If I don't read the word of God, how can I expect God to speak through me? If you look at history, there are many great men whom we see, and many of them came to know God's calling only when they read the word of God. We know Martin Luther, how he came. When he was reading the book of Romans, God spoke to him. And that's the power of the word of God. So the first thing that we saw is being born again. And the second thing that we see is reading the word of God. The third thing is speakers and mentors. What do I mean? We know about Timothy. Timothy was a young, timid person. And after he was saved, Paul sent him to Ephesus. And he sent him to mentor the church there. When Timothy went to Ephesus, he faced a lot of problems. Being a young person, he faced a lot of challenges. And this was very difficult for Timothy. Though being young, there were many elders, and he was very much confused whether he should remain in the ministry or he should quit and come back. And he was in a kind of dilemma during those times. He was doubting his calling, and he was prone to neglect his spiritual gift. And during that time, Paul is writing the letter to Timothy. And he's mentioning Timothy, Timothy, don't give up. Keep on going. That letter that Paul wrote was a confirmation of his calling. When he was in a dilemma to quit, Paul's letter brought a rekindling in his heart. And Timothy stayed there to finish the task. You know, God can use people. Maybe it is a mentor. Maybe it is a pastor. Maybe it is a preacher. Maybe in a conference. Maybe through a personal 2-by-2 interaction. Maybe through a letter. But God uses all these things to confirm his calling. Are we listening to his call? It's very important. So the first thing that we saw is being born again. Second is reading his word. Third is through mentors and speakers. And the fourth is through situations. Through situation, God can reveal his call. We all know about Jonah. He was the great missionary. When God called Jonah to go to Nineveh, he went to Tarsus. What happened? There was a storm. The people in the ship realized that this is not an ordinary storm. They have been in ship many times. But this storm that they were facing was something very peculiar. And so they were sitting and discussing, what is this going on? And as they were sitting and discussing, they realized that this storm is brought by a divine intervention. They knew that there is something very unnatural and very supernatural that is controlling this storm. And they were trying to find out who is responsible for this. And as they were trying to find out, Jonah was sitting there knowing everything that is happening. And as they threw the lot fell on Jonah. And they asked, what did you do? And Jonah is telling in verse 10 of chapter 1, I am running. Where are you running from? I am running from the call and the responsibility that is given to me. That is what he's telling to the people. And because I am disobedient, God has brought this storm in my life. We should remember that God can bring any situation in our life to get our attention so that we look at Him. Through different situations that God brings, we can be confirmed that there is a call to which we are disobeying. It's very important, dear friends. No matter wherever we go, His Spirit will find us. That is what the psalmist says. So that's very important. So many times we see the situation plays such a role in our life that it leads us to the calling that God has given. Today, are you facing any situation? If you are going against of God's call, then God is still ready to bring you back. And it's very important that we listen to Him. The fifth thing through which God can speak is the burden in the heart. Burden in the heart. We all know Amy Carmichael. Amy Carmichael was a very young girl. She was 28 years old when she came to India. When she reached India, she gathered few of the sisters. And along with the sisters, she started to go to different villages to share the gospel. And during that time of visit, she came to know about the temple prostitutes. When she came to know about these temple prostitutes, she was very much disturbed. She wanted to do something, but she really did not know what to do. One fine morning, very early in the morning, a 7-year-old girl ran from the temple. She had escaped from the temple and she came. And she came to Amy and she said, I need your help. I don't want to go back to the temple. I don't want to live the life that I have been leading. But can you help me? When this girl was talking about her experience of what goes in the temple, Amy Carmichael was moved. And God put a burden in her heart. And what was the result? It was the Donavar Fellowship that came up. And through Donavar Fellowship, many children were rescued and brought into a shelter. Today, has God given you any burden? It is very important that we keep our eyes, heart, and ears open. As Jonah uncle was sharing, there are a lot of opportunities. Somewhere down our heart, there will be a burden that God is reigniting. And we need to obey and go for that. And that's very important. And the next thing about God's calling is the feedback that we get from others. We know this great man, Billy Graham. When Billy Graham went to preach his first sermon, he was doubtful. Should I go? Should I preach? And it so happened, he was called to a very small church. And in the church, when he preached, God used him and spoke to the people in that church. And after the church service, many of them came to him. And they said, Billy, God spoke to us through your word. And that was the turning point in his life. through his audience, through his sermons, through the feedbacks, Billy realized that God had called him of a preaching life. Many times, God can confirm us through the people around us about our calling. And we need to be careful to listen to them. Many times we may have certain gifts and talents. We may be using them, but we may be doubtful whether it is correct. Am I called? During those times, these people's feedback will really help us. Finally, the seventh thing that we need to see is a divine dissatisfaction. Divine dissatisfaction. When we read the book of Habakkuk, we see that God has brought the people of Israel from Babylon to Israel before they were captives. And when God brought them, these people started to make their own homes. They started to build houses. They started to build different farmings. They started to grow trees, wine presses, all these things they were doing. But at the end of the day, they were not happy. They were not satisfied. And when we read Haggai chapter 1 verse 6, God says, you have planted, but the harvest is less. You eat, but you are not satisfied. You drink, but you're still thirsty. You put on clothes, but you don't feel warm. Your wages disappear as though they were put in pockets of holes. This shows that they were dissatisfied. Why was this happening to them? When God called them to build his church, to build his temple, these people were more interested in building their own houses. These people left God, and because of that, there was no satisfaction in their life. And as a result, there was no success. Now, what does this warn us? This warns us that when we focus on fulfilling our own desire, not God's desire, we will end up being a failure. You remember that businessman about whom I told? Very rich, very successful, but deep down, no satisfaction. If we are not doing God's will, then what will happen? We will face dissatisfaction in his life. It's very important. I don't know how many of you are dissatisfied with what you are doing today. Even though you may not get a high salary, even though you may not be very popular, but when you give your life, there will be satisfaction and joy. My mother died in 2015 out of cancer. And one day I was sitting with her and I asked, Ma, do you regret what has happened with you? She said, no, son, I am satisfied with what has happened. When we listen to the call, then what happens is we will be able to be satisfied in whatever way God is going to use us. So how do we know that I am called? First thing is we need to be born again. Second thing is we need to read the word of God. Third thing is through speakers and mentors that God has provided. Fourth thing is through different situations that God's bring. Fifth thing is the burden that he will give in our heart. Sixth is through the feedback that we receive. Finally, in seventh, the divine dissatisfaction that we do when we try to fulfill our own purposes. Now we need to remember this. On the day of judgment, we will not be judged on what we did, but we will be judged on what we were called to do. And that's very important. Many times we think what God will be judging us for. He will be judging us for what he called us to do, but we never did it. That's going to be very bad. Today, Are we listening to his call? Are we doing why he has called us to do? If we are not doing it, then it's very important that we need to check it. And God uses different means and different methods to reveal his calling in our life. It's very important that we listen to him. And there is a danger that I want to warn you with. If we again and again keep on rejecting his call, he is going to leave it. But at the end of the day, when the judgment comes, what will we be doing? Shall we close our eyes? Shall we think about the word that has come? Shall we ponder on this question? Through this youth meeting, God must be speaking to many of us through different ways, through different people. But are we listening? Or do we still think that no, it is not for me, it is for somebody else?